Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. Now, this is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of the week's top stories. Thanks for joining us. I'm Peter Ndoro and this is what's coming up on the show. Children make up around 35% of South Africa's population, and yet the coverage of children's issues tends to be minimal. We'll find out this during the show. Icasa and Multichoice will be going head-to-head in court as the regulator is pushing ahead with its plans to open up the market, of which the pay TV giant says will impose far-reaching restrictions on its business. American news-based pay television channel CNN announced this past week that it would be cutting jobs, citing the move on what it calls a huge decline in ratings, and that's particularly in its London office. And as usual, we get our guests to unpack the Sunday papers. Well, these are just some of the stories that we'll be tackling on the show. But first, let's take a look at what's on the front pages of your Sunday newspapers this morning. And we start with the Sunday Times headline, and that story, the headline story there says it talks about the ANC's Integrity Commission facing an angry backlash with calls by top ANC leaders apparently calling for the commission to disband. 23 names were put forward by the commission suggesting that they should not take up public office. Its reporting is being presented to the NEC this weekend. The City Press headline, Ramaphosa flexes his muscles. The story says that the ANC president read the Riot Act to NEC members, described as being loose cannons, making contrary comments. Now, the president apparently called for restraint and discipline, whilst Secretary General Ace Magashule was brought to task for his alleged links with Mzwanele Manyi's African Transformation Movement, the ATM. The Sunday Independent lead story talks about a raid on the offices of the Limpopo Premier, Stan Matabata, and several houses, seizing computers and documents relating to international trips the Premier made over the past 5 years. It seems that Limpopo officials are being accused of travel cost-related scam. The Sunday Tribune is leading with an interview they had with embattled eThekwini Mayor Zandile Gumede, who seems to be fighting back against some of her accusers. She said to be calling for an investigation into the promotion of MK veterans, an issue that led to violent protests on the eve of this year's general elections, if you remember. And the Weekend Argus says headlines, it says Manic Monday for My City transport users, and it seems that thousands of commuters may be stranded tomorrow as no contracts were secured by the City of Cape Town to provide transport on several bus routes. This apparently after negotiations with service providers collapsed. Right, as you can see, there's so much to get through on the show this morning, and helping us to make sense of these stories, my guests are CEO and founder of Ambani Reputation Management, Shoni Makari, and a new face on Media Monitor, political journalist at News 24, Lizeka Tandwa. To my guests, a very good morning to you. Thanks very much for joining me. Welcome. Now, let's begin with this first story. Pay TV giant MultiChoice has gone to court to fight a legal battle with the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, Icasa, accusing the regulatory authority of not understanding the broadcast terrain and rushing to impose licensing conditions that MultiChoice says will put them out of business, advantaging international players.
Giving testimony on the last day of public hearings, the SABC said sporting rights should be accessible to the majority of South Africans. It said MultiChoice had an unfair advantage over most of these rights. The public broadcaster wants Icasa to regulate the pricing model. It says it spent over 3 billion rand to secure sporting rights, but this is unsustainable as prices are inflated and in some instances even doubled.
What we hope to achieve is that there's going to be transparency through the regulations. The regulator must come in and state very clearly a sub-licensing framework which assists the free-to-air broadcasters to be able to acquire these rights in the interest of the public. So we want these rights to be accessible, and we want the rights regime as it stands now to be. We use a concept called unbundling. So you don't have all the rights to yourself, but these rights can be broken up for free-to-air, for pay television. So that is going to make a fair access for those who want to bid for the rights.
MultiChoice, which owns SuperSport, spends 2 billion rand a year on sport. It testified that 60% of its revenue came from broadcasting rights. It said the current regulations were fair and balanced and should not be changed.
Yes, our argument is that most of these rights are residing with the SuperSport, and we sub-license this right from SuperSport. So the biggest challenge is that the prices are too high and we find it very difficult to afford them.
The SABC says it currently has no choice but to broadcast most of the Cricket World Cup matches delayed as it is too expensive to secure the rights. The broadcaster is hoping for a holistic regulations framework which will enhance fair competition in the broadcasting sector. Naledi Matlapeng, SABC News, Pretoria.
All right, so my guest editors, is it fair to break up MultiChoice's monopoly? Let's start with you.
Well, actually, I think the chickens are finally coming home to roost for MultiChoice. It had a dominance on the pay TV space for far too long. So, unfortunately, when you're in a monopoly, you tend to get comfortable, and they became comfortable. They didn't see the Netflixes of this world coming into play. And finally, they've been caught basically napping. And they're playing the victim card, which I don't think is necessarily the case. They've got the resources. They should have actually invested in new technologies a long time ago.
Well, they're trying to fight back. I think they've got Showmax or something or the other. But I guess the issue here is that Icasa's had, 25 years to figure this out. MultiChoice has been on its own forever. And now they're saying, hang on, we have to level the playing field. So is this a little too late, do you think? What are your thoughts? Because even the pay television concept as it stands probably is a thing of the past already.
Exactly, but I don't think it's too late, considering that I, as a consumer, I still have to pay exorbitant fees to the pay TV as a pay TV subscriber. MultiChoice, as my colleague has just said, MultiChoice has had a monopoly in controlling this market. There needs to be a broadening of the market. We need to see more. We need to have more options in the market, and also I think other broadcasters would like to have those rights as well. We do have. MultiChoice has kind of argued that by regulating just them, they will, Icasa will allow for these internet giants to come into the fold and to ensure that they increase their market in South Africa and they put them in the back banner. I don't think that's so. I think that we need, as the consumer, as South Africans, we need more variety. We need to see a lot of broadening of the scope.
All right, and that's a good on paper and in terms of thinking about the right thing to do. But I guess what we're stuck with now is the consumer at home. What must he do? Must he have 5 boxes stacked on top of each other? Or, because at the moment we only have to deal with one. There will be some resistance for new players. Already I think there was another player that came into the pay TV space. I forget the name now.
Top TV, I think.
Yeah, Top TV. So aren't the consumers going to push back?
Well, I think, to what Lizak was saying earlier, for me, just simply focus on giving the consumer more options, and then let them decide, how they basically consume their information, entertainment, and so on. I don't think we should necessarily worry about it. How will we be given access to it? More likely, most of this is going to go through fiber. You see the likes of Vumatel have been really busy laying, fiber all over town. So ultimately, we're going to have more bandwidth, we're going to have more access, and anyone who still have, this huge bricks and mortar infrastructure is in serious trouble, essentially.
So they're getting punished for being first out of the gate 25 years, 30 years ago.
Absolutely, but I mean, look at the other ICT space. You know, Microsoft for a very long time was the ICT giant, and then the Googles of this world came in, the Facebooks of this world came in. So you do need to actually be constantly reviewing the environment and see where you need to stay on top of the innovation curve. And they didn't do that.
Again, it sounds great, but Lizeka, what's going to happen is that the international players are not going to be regulated because they're based in other jurisdictions. And we just go online to access their content. So isn't it unfair for MultiChoice that they have to be regulated in South Africa for South African conditions, whereas Netflix doesn't need to pay attention at all to South Africa?
Unfair, maybe you could say it's a little unfair for them, but I think that they have been in this market for so long, and then they have been, you know, sleeping on the job, and we can't really now be to blame for that. They need to be regulated. They can't have sporting rights. They can't have sporting contracts. They can't have, you know, Hollywood channels coming only to them. I am so passionate about this. There needs to be a more competitive space, and we need to have choices.
All right, so, and that's good again, but if MultiChoice are bleeding subscribers, what will splitting it do? Because the next operator that comes in is going to struggle to get subscribers, surely.
Well, we should not take the approach that MultiChoice is too big to fail. I think we need to allow for competition to determine who ultimately becomes the survivor. So if it means that broadcast model or that delivery channel model for them is outdated and they ultimately have to go out of business, you know, so be it. Absolutely, because we cannot say we're going to protect businesses at the expense of consumers. They need to find a way to deliver the content in a way that is affordable and, you know, appealing to the consumer. That's what business is about, responding to customer needs. You know, finish and clear, to quote some other people.
All right, so Icasa is saying that, look, you talked about Hollywood movies at the moment. I think MultiChoice is one of the few pay TV channels in the world that has access to all the Hollywood studios' movies. Icasa is saying that must end, other people must share in the movies, and also, and I've seen this in the UK, where they split the sporting rights amongst a number of players, and that's what you're hoping will happen here. How will that affect us as consumers? Do you think it'll make it cheaper for us?
I hope so. I hope it will make it cheaper. I mean, I am paying 900 rands a month as it stands. And you look at, for instance, I'm a huge sporting fan. You look at, for instance, your UEFA Champions Leagues, which were previously being broadcast in, I think it was ETV at that point. I didn't really have, I could have had like a smaller bouquet. I could have chosen to have a much cheaper bouquet. But now, because I want to watch those channels, I want to watch, you know, those lovely channels, it becomes really expensive for me as a consumer, as the audience. So I really hope that it does allow for that kind of space and it breaks that monopoly.
And just one other thing, Peter. One of the reasons I'm very I'm not sympathetic to MultiChoice, that some years ago I was part of a strategic session where we were talking about what's going to happen to this sector, and I remember distinctly saying to them that this model is going to become outdated. And quite frankly, they must have thought I was smoking something. So clearly, this is what we're dealing with. So, you know, this is something I said about 10 years ago to them privately. Right. You know, that, you know what, you need to start thinking about different delivery models. You need to think about us as consumers having a choice in terms of, for instance, you get the premium bouquet, right? And then you're given things that you know, I've got Islamic TV, I've got, I'm not Muslim, you know, but I'm forced to have it. I'm paying for something that I'll never ever consume. You know, it's crazy. You know.
So it is interesting what you're talking about, forcing people to consume certain things, and I suppose, and this is one of the things, I've got access to, I don't know how many hundred channels, but I probably only watch 5 or 6.
Exactly.
I should only pay for those 5 or 6, and I suppose with competition, much like music, you buy what you want to listen to. You don't have to buy the whole album anymore. that's probably the way that they should be thinking about going.
And that's what Netflix has introduced to this market, which is why pay TV subscribers have kind of moved away from MultiChoice, and which was MultiChoice has been complaining about. They've lost 100,000 premium subscribers already to Netflix, because Netflix has introduced a model where we are able to go into that platform and be able to choose whatever we want to watch, whereas we are forced to consume whatever MultiChoice determines is right for us, is right for that premium subscriber. So I'm baffled that they were told about this 10 years ago and they didn't realize that the 4IR was coming into play.
All right, so no sympathy at all from the floor.
No.
Zero.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll start taking a look at issues around reporting for children. Stay with us.
Sarah, who climbed Everest, she arrived here with much jubilation.
I took every African with me to the top of the world.
Most of the names on the wall are of soldiers who lost their lives in Somalia under the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM.
In Africa, we have Ubuntu.
We need to make more integration.
The highlight of the Zigama is the highest bungee jump in the world.
The main driver of that area is tourism.
The SABC News mobile app is your one-stop digital portal to all the news you need. Stay connected with the latest in breaking news. Watch the SABC News Channel along with clips and live streams of all the big news events. And listen to all the SABC News radio stations live, including podcasts and much more. Simply download the SABC News app to your Android or iOS device from either the Play Store or the App Store. SABC News, independent, impartial.
We do not just speak. We let every voice in our nation find full expression in language and in culture. We do not just teach. We empower all people with education. We do not just bring you the news. We place you where the news is happening. We do not just entertain. We take you on journeys. We do not just broadcast sport. We create an arena for sporting heroes to inspire you. Ours is not just a job, it's a calling to ensure that everyone in our nation is informed, educated, and entertained. We're able to do this because you do your part. SABC TV licenses. It's all made possible by you.
Hello, I'm Nana, and I want to tell you a bit about Economics Unbound. It is a live studio current affairs program that brings an understanding of the economy, how it operates, and how it is managed. The show seeks to include ordinary South Africans in purposeful and well-informed discussions about the economy.
For you to be in business, you need to work with other businesses,
while providing them with enough information to make better economic and financial decisions.
Bringing informal sectors into a formal economy and making it more inclusive.
Any business opportunity that is below 1 million must be given to a township entrepreneurship.
Through this program, audiences can look forward to 30 minutes of deep and tough questioning on the issues of the week.
To whom does women's unpaid work go?
Now, with June 16 in mind, when students marched at the beginning of the Soweto uprising in 1976 that saw brutal apartheid police kill and wound hundreds of children, South Africa now remembers at that time, dedicating the month of June every year as Youth Month. We too will be taking a look at our young people on Media Monitor this month. Now, media reporting on children and young people should never put them at risk. UNICEF has developed principles and guidelines to help journalists report on children's issues in a way that enables them to serve the public interest without compromising the rights of children. Here at home, Media Monitoring Africa, an organisation that acts in a watchdog role to promote ethical and fair journalism that supports human rights, had a media workshop recently reflecting on the legalities and ethical reporting regarding children. And to take us through that, I'm now joined on the line by their director, William Bird. William, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Good morning, Peter. Thanks for having me on.
All right, just before we get into the children reporting, we've just had an interesting discussion about MultiChoice, and I was just wondering, as someone who monitors media, what's your comment and thought about the move that MultiChoice is making against Icasa about splitting the pie?
So look, as I understand it, the MultiChoice's court case is about Icasa's process and about the fact that they haven't made the research that they've done available to everyone, and that the document that they then presented as the rationale for their latest document is not sufficient. And I think, they're entitled to raise those concerns. In our submission with SOS, we raised similar concerns about the fact that it's all well and fine to attempt to deal with MultiChoice now, but actually we must be preparing for dealing with the new gorillas that are coming, and that being Netflix and Amazon. Unless we impose similar obligations on them around ownership issues, around paying tax, around transformation, around local content, you can be sure that they aren't going to want to adhere to those things. And so it's not enough to then say, MultiChoice must do these and these and these things, but we're going to leave the door wide open for these other people to effectively decimate our local content sector, because you can be sure that it's not only MultiChoice that would suffer in that environment. It would be particularly the SABC.
Oh, it's an interesting space to watch, certainly going forward. But it is Youth Month, and so we're always mindful of our young citizens in the country. You had a workshop recently to, I guess, refresh our journalists about working with children, reporting on children. Take us through some of the things that came out.
So we ran it together with the Children's Institute, who are a group of people that are based at UCT, and they do an annual child gate, which is really one of the best things about South African child-focused research. And what we were looking to do was, remind journalists of the difficulties and the challenges, and also the exciting opportunities of reporting on and around children. So we actually also in Child Protection Week. So in as much as we look on at young people and children in particular as these things that are often victims of abuse, we need to be looking at how do we protect them and what role media play in that. So in that regard, the workshop was really focused on dealing with ethical dilemmas that journalists face in reporting them. I saw from coverage on SABC's stories that they've been doing on reporting on child abuse, they've been very careful not to identify or reveal anything that may identify any of the children involved, and that's one of the crucial things. But of course, it's also just about understanding that children are citizens as well, and they also have rights to participate in democracy, and we need to make sure that we hear their voices. So in as much as we say hear their voices, we also have an obligation to say hear their voices in a responsible manner that doesn't cause them further harm or trauma, which is, of course, a very difficult thing to do.
So what are some of the things, do you think, that we are still getting wrong as journalists?
So I think there are a few things. Part of them is that we still find occasions where media will name or identify a child who is a victim of trauma or abuse, and that clearly has a very negative impact on them. It can cause them secondary trauma. It can have an impact on their legal case. There are all sorts of negative consequences. So just in the last couple of weeks, one of our newspapers, the Sowetan, for example, has been conducting interviews with children who've been in similar traumatized circumstances, and that's a very difficult thing to do, and a huge problem in terms of interviewing children that are going through trauma. We also, I think the biggest thing, though, is that we tend not to look at issues even when they affect young people most adversely and actually solicit their views. So it's not about saying we should interview children who've been abused. I think that there's little value in doing that, really. I think what it is about doing is understanding, what children's roles are in society more broadly, so that we give them a sense that they are actually human beings capable of agency. So when there's a bus strike, for example, or when metro trains are burnt and they can't operate, the people often that suffer the most adverse consequences of that are usually children, because they can't get to school, or it means they're at more risk when they have to walk to school on their own. And it's about understanding some of those dilemmas. So all of the big problems we have, if you want to see who really is going to be at the knife edge of those things, it's very often young people and children in particular. And we need to start understanding what the impact of that is, so that we can start to build a more humane society.
All right, so there is often this challenge when you've got a live story. Before, if it's something that's recorded or set up in advance, often you have to get the permission of the parents for the children to appear on camera. What do you do in a situation where it's live, it's happening, and the parents are not there? Do you not give those children a voice in that moment?
Well, it depends on the circumstance. If you're at an event and children are being beaten or something like that, then obviously you need to make sure that you do your job as a journalist. But if you are going to set up to go and report on a story of abuse, for example, at a school or at a clinic or somewhere, walking in and just saying, right, let's talk to the first child that's been abused or violated, I don't think is going to be that helpful, because when you look at that, you have to say, what is the value that it brings to a news story? Do we really need to hear a child break down in order to understand that abusing them is wrong, or that it was a painful experience? I don't think so. We don't do that very often with adults. Why? Because most of the time adults then have the ability, or they often have people around them to say, no, you're not actually going to do this. So these things have class dimensions, and they have race dimensions and gender dimensions to them. So these are really about making sure that our journalists are a lot more aware and cognizant of the various ethical issues that they need to take into account when they report on young people. Young people have, under Section 28 of our Constitution, they're afforded greater rights than any other group of people in our Constitution, in fact. And that means that has to filter down through all elements of our society. It's why we have special laws for them. We have a Children's Act. We have special laws around all sorts of things, around schooling, etc., that says we need to take greater care of them. And it's just that same focus needs to apply when we report on them as well.
All right, William, thanks so much indeed for joining us and continuing to highlight these important issues, particularly around our young people. Thanks very much indeed for your time. All right, so that was William Bird, who's the director at Media Monitoring Africa, talking about a workshop that they did recently with journalists around reporting about children. Let's talk a little bit about that, my guest editors. Let me start with you, Lizeka, who's a political reporter. So you're out there often. And I'm curious, from just listening to what William was saying, do you get training as journalists about reporting with children, or do you find out literally on the job sometimes?
You do get training, but I think that, like William was saying, there are some tricky ethical issues that you find yourself faced with on the field. Like, for instance, what comes to mind for me is just a couple of weeks ago, students from Korsas were marching to the Luthuli House, and there was a press briefing at that particular time, and you're faced with a dilemma where you have to interview 15-year-olds, and those are classified as kids up until you're 18. So and then they marched to Hillbrow, where they caused a racket, and you have to, we've in a world now where we report via social media. We have instant reportage. So you have to keep in mind that you're reporting about kids, and you're reporting about children. There are certain issues or ethical dimensions where you can't falter. It's very important for us to have refresher courses every now and again to kind of remind ourselves of how to report on children, ethical reporting on children. And I think what piqued my interest, particularly with the biz community story, was that it's 35%. Kids are 35% of the country, and our reportage on issues that affect them, setting the agenda on agenda setting subjects is very minimal. If we're speaking about kids, we either speaking about tragedies that affect them, or we're speaking about your extraordinary child who has gone to London for whatever bursary, or a child who had this amount of marks or scored this in their matric exams, or what say you. So we need to really be mindful that kids also need content. We also need, whenever we're reporting, even as a political reporter myself, I need to be aware that there is a lot that affects the kids when I am reporting my stories.
All right, Shirley, but the waters have been muddied a little bit though, because Elizeka was talking about social media. So we are taught, do not name the children. But on social media, it's trending and the names are there. And so there's this challenge all the time, is that they might read our story as journalists and we don't put the names in there, but there are people on social media that don't care. And so we almost get caught up in this whirlwind, I guess. And that's quite challenging now.
No, indeed. In fact, I mean, corporates obviously also have social media platforms, and especially within the NGO space, back in the days it was almost fashionable to portray the African child with hunger and flies all over. And I'm very encouraged to see the fact that you have companies like or organizations the likes of the Tiger Brands Foundation, where they actually have guidelines on how you portray children on all public platforms, where you maintain the dignity of the child. And I don't think they're alone. I think there's a trend where more and more organizations are becoming aware of the fact that we need to preserve the dignity of the child. Now, of course, the average person, that's a conversation that needs to happen at a broader space, but we can start with sensitizing people at different organizations, because most people are part of different organizations. So when you're sensitized in that space, hopefully when you go to participate on social media in your personal capacity, you'll be mindful of the fact that you need to protect the dignity of the child. But yes, it's still quite a big challenge, because you see that all the time. People forget that, for instance, if you are a witness on a very important court case, and we know that children are very often victims of abuse and whatnot. So we need to protect that person, both as a witness and as an individual.
All right, this is something we could talk about for ages. And one of my pet peeves is you have all these restrictions on television, language and that kind of thing. And then you get in the car driving your kids to school, and one of the songs that comes on air is got graphic content in there. There seems to be inconsistencies in terms how several medias are treated. But conversation for another day, because we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back we'll have more for you right here on Media Monitor. Stay with us.
The SABC News mobile app is your one-stop digital portal to all the news you need. Stay connected with the latest in breaking news. Watch the SABC News Channel along with clips and live streams of all the big news events. And listen to all the SABC News radio stations live, including podcasts and much more. Simply download the SABC News app to your Android or iOS device from either the Play Store or the App Store. SABC News, independent, impartial.
In my time, I've truly seen it all firsthand. Angizwanga ngizibonele ngalawam amehlo. Going through my photographs and reflecting on my memory box really brings back many life experiences that are bittersweet and humbling. In this, my homeland, I've entertained tourists and offshore traders. I've evolved from dealing with the battering system to trading foreign exchange. I've traveled to the ends of the world and tasted a diversity of culinary palates. To outsiders, I have lived alongside wild animals, tamed some, and collected livestock as wealth. So my memory box is overflowing. And don't get me wrong, I'm not bragging, but in fact, I'm breaking and hurting deep down inside of this heart of mine. Why? What for? I hear you ask yourself, my fellow Africans, friends and family. The images I have of me are those of the point of view of my onlooker, not those of myself, the subject at hand. I'm choking and suffocating at the chalice those anthropologists and filmmakers tie around me as some sort of grand name tag. Stories have been made and told of me, not of my own words. Films and graphic images have entertained millions of audiences at my expense.
Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now, the global news network CNN is cutting back on its UK operation. Its London-based television news operation will see job losses as some of its programming will be moved to Abu Dhabi, New York, and CNN headquarters in Atlanta. Now, the digital and news gathering operations will be preserved, with the cuts likely to hit the teams that produce live TV programs and individual shows. CNN President Jeff Zucker told staff that the international channel was losing $10 million or 142 million rand a year. So the question is, are there lessons for South Africa there? Let's find out from my guest editors. Okay, so CNN, global news network, huge, enormous, but it's you losing $10 million a year. Are there lessons that we can learn here in South Africa? Because we've just seen the launch of a new channel, News Africa, and I'm just wondering, can you actually even make money in news at all if someone like CNN can't?
Well, I think the important lesson there is not so much just for South Africa, but for the whole world. I alluded to this earlier, that business exists to respond to a need, a market need. I don't know if you remember the song, Do You Know That, You're My Hero? With CNN, it's like, do you know that we're our own hero? There's no channel that I know, and I watch news all the time, that promotes itself on its own channels as much as CNN. It's almost nauseating. So the content there, if you ask for the lesson, the lesson is the content. Are you responding to the needs? You're a global channel, and you focus probably 70-80% of American news. Watch Al Jazeera, for instance. Hell, watch SABC International. You get a much broader sense of what is happening around the world than you do in South Africa. When CNN covers us, it's when we've had a tragedy. That's their interest. And you know what? They love, positioning themselves in Alexandra. If you had never come to South Africa, you will think South Africa looks like. Absolutely.
So what you're saying is that it's content really more than anything else.
Certainly the delivery channel also, they need to modify that and actually understand the kind of world we live in terms of how to deliver that in a much more cost-effective manner. But it doesn't matter how cost-effective they are. If the content is not what people want, no one is going to watch. They'll lose a lot more than what they're losing right now.
All right. It is interesting because what they've done is that they've preserved the digital space. You work for News 24, so you understand digital reporting now much, much more. Is it the world that we're living in, is that we're not sitting on our television screens as much as we used to, and that maybe it's about these kinds of screens, tablets and phones and computers, and maybe that's what we need to be thinking about here at home as well?
Exactly, I think that you've said it before with MultiChoice, that you don't spend that much time on your television as you used to as a person. But also, it's not something that is unique to CNN, the fact that they're losing these millions in their revenue. This is something that is affecting us. I know from speaking to colleagues at different agencies, they are affected by the global downturn. But also the fact that we are moving towards a digital space where digital first or news that is covered on social media or news that is covered on digital platforms, like for instance News 24, tend to be more viable for the consumer than watching it on television or than reading it on newspapers. So there's a lot of, I just what comes to mind is Diesel Black Star.
Yeah.
They are currently facing, the staff, they are currently facing possible retrenchments. It happened with Media 24 as well, and SABC. So it's something that it's happening globally. We are facing a terrible time in the media industry.
All right, and part of that is these platforms, Facebook and Twitter and so on and so forth. The thing that gets me, though, is you can't trust the news on these platforms because they're not curated, they're not managed, and yet they're getting the lion's share of the advertising. Explain that to me.
Well, I'm not in the news or media business, but I would certainly hope that the people who are tasked with the business of managing news creation organization are thinking about better ways of disseminating without necessarily losing the expertise that is currently contained within these institutions, because it will be a sad day when you open a Business Day or some other newspaper and there's nothing intriguing in it, because why all the experienced journalists have been fired in favor of the younger, less expensive ones to try and respond to the financial challenges of media. So that media is going through. So yeah, that is the I mean, you remember the days when the internet first burst into the scene.
Yeah.
No one actually trusted it. Today, you can actually pull an article from the internet and use it as part of an academic study.
Yeah.
So we are probably going to move in terms of trust levels to that level. I mean, look at what Zuckerberg has been doing. He's going around the world trying to convince governments that he's going to take action to at least rid the platforms of fake news for start. So I think we're probably going to get to a point where the content is a lot more trustworthy than it currently is. They're certainly not going anywhere, so we need to get used to that, idea.
And I guess it's an evolution. I mean, I remember Naspers, they owned advertising in the country before television came. 76 came television, and Naspers was bleeding advertising revenue. And that's when they came up with the idea of pay television, because they needed a space to compete. And I suppose all that we're seeing is that these constant evolutions, revolutions, and 4IR is bringing it to the table. Newspapers have to think about redelivering their product in another way. Is it just another step in our journey?
We are evolving. I mean, it is an evolution of the space, of the media space, and we have to evolve with it. We have to, I mean, every journalist now knows that they have to be, armed with the knowing how to report on social media, armed with knowing how to be able to quickly report stories. It's always you must be first with your story. So it's vital for us to kind of educate or inform ourselves with what is going on in the world and how 4IR is taking over, and there's no way around it.
And in the end, content and trust will be the currency. All right, let's take a look at our newspapers now, and I'm going to start with you, Lizeka. As a political journalist, is there anything that grabbed your attention in the newspapers? Which paper in particular?
There was Sunday Times. There was a particular story by Kanisa Hunters. I thought it was quite
which paper was that in?
Sunday Times.
Sunday Times.
Yeah, I thought it was quite a cute story, considering that we've just been bombarded with heavy political rhetoric throughout. And it was around what, I think it was Sunday Times. It was around what now cabinet ministers were doing when they got that call from the Director General.
Right.
And some of them were watching Moja Love. Some of them were having drinks with friends. I think Tulas Ngesi, the now Minister of is it Labour and Employment?
Yes.
Yeah, was having drinks with friends, and Fikile Mbalula as well was having drinks with friends, interestingly enough, and then he snuck out as soon as he got that call. Some of them must have known. I mean, I'm sure they knew. I mean, because of that, Dlamini Zuma says that she was busy with ANC matters when she received the call.
I was waiting for a call. It never came. Anyway, never mind. Shoni, interestingly, you know one of the ministers. You went to school with him.
So that naturally was the story that I gravitated towards.
And that was in which paper?
It was on City Press.
Okay.
She's one of the younger ministers to come in. I I remember her being very, very politically active.
She's the now Minister of Small Business,
Minister of Small Businesses. Yeah. And the one story that I will never forget is when she first arrived, we had standards then. So she was in standard 6.
Which is grade 8 now.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. And then she was elected SRC president. And I remember, literally on her first year. And myself and a lot of other seniors, if you like, I remember ourselves thinking, we're not going to be led by a toddler. Well, look at her now. But she knew what she was talking about. She was very smart.
So it didn't surprise you that she's made cabinet at such a young age?
Absolutely not. Even way back then, she was an incredibly smart young lady.
Yeah.
And obviously she went on to, I think she studied MBA and another master's qualification. So throughout her journey, I mean, she's always been, ahead of her time, if you like.
So is there someone to watch that she could become the first female president in the country in the future?
Well, if she was the first one, I would think that we're probably going to be in good hands.
Yeah.
But one caution there, maybe, and I hope she's listening, that you need to stop making the media your enemy. They're not.
Yes.
They simply report on things that happen. And, she's always got this thing about media creating their own narrative.
Yeah.
Get a good media person to help you, travel that journey, because the media are not going anywhere as long as we remain a democracy. Learn to live with them, please.
All right, Lizeka, you're a political reporter, so I'm gonna take you back to the Sunday Times, and it's the ANC's Integrity Commission facing a backlash, and it seems that President Ramaphosa is now saying, I'm in charge and you guys will toe the line. Again, I suppose it had to come at some point. Your thoughts?
I mean, we as in the political space, political reporters, we're expecting him at some point to, ensure that people within the NEC toe the party line. It was necessary for him to kind of read them the riot act, if you will. The fact is, they've been speaking with dissenting voices. No one knows what exactly the ANC message is. Is it President Ramaphosa who ensured that, who delivered the ANC its win, or is it the ANC?
Yeah.
What is going on is what is going on within the ANC's SGO office. You look at our WhatsApp group; it's a disaster. You get one press release from advisory from one person, you get another, and you get another, and it's one person, Dakota is saying one thing, Pule is saying another. So it really there needs to be a consensus going forward, and he needed to say that. He needed to let them know. And Ace Magashule happens to be always at the center of that.
So you are a reputation specialist. It doesn't help the organization when these mixed signals are being sent out all the time. They need to start to have one voice, right?
No, indeed, because even when people were voting, saying, okay, provincially, for instance, and we know that the numbers support this story, that we're not going to give the ANC our vote, but nationally we'll give it to Ramaphosa. He can't do this on his own, and at some point the organization needs to, get in shape in terms of how it portrays itself. There seems to be a group that understands that actually you're here to serve people, you're not here for your own sake. And if you're going to build an organization that can be trusted, credibility is the key word. You need to actually start to look like people who can be trusted. Right now you have, but of course we know why they're saying singing from different hymn sheets, because people have issues that they're trying to cover up, and they're trying to, diversion essentially is what's being done here. What we're happy to see that is no longer coming up is this whole narrative of, white monopoly capital. I think that seems to have died down among other radical economic transformation. And so
all right, in a minute, 30 seconds each, let's start with you. What do you think this week is going to be a big story or something that we need to look out for? I guess more revelations from the state capture inquiry. What else do you think?
More revelations from the state capture inquiry. I think that we can expect, our ministers to finally give us an idea, an idea of what they planned to do. I'm looking forward to the Ministry of Small Business. I'm looking forward to the Justice Ministry. I think that's going to be interesting. What Ronald Lamola intends to do. He's already started talking.
I think the Mkwebane show is going to continue.
Oh, right.
She's digging her own grave each day, I think. And more and more people are beginning to say,
she can't afford another loss, eh?
Absolutely. And if this one comes, I think that will be the final nail.
All right.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. You guys were great.
Thank you.
Shoni Lizeka, hopefully we'll see you again in the near future, but thanks so much indeed for being on my program.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
You at home, thanks very much indeed. Have a lovely Sunday. We'll see you next week at the same time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.